Sukrit, have you joined?
Yes, I'm in.
Yeah. Maybe we can, while I know people are still joining, we can start with maybe a quick background and intro. You can put up the slides.
Sure.
Thanks, Sukrit. So, hello everyone, and welcome to yet another webinar that we are holding from the NDHM Sandbox team. The intent of today's webinar, and this is something that we've been holding up for quite some time, been quite some time in planning and also getting some things ready to release, is about how the ecosystem players can essentially create better experiences and control the experiences for patients in your own mobile PHR apps. So we'll get into that in a bit. Sukrit, next slide. There's going to be, in terms of the format, we're going to use the same format as we've done in other webinars. We're going to give breaks and have plenty of time for Q&A. So Sukrit or any of the other team members will usually start by explaining a concept, and then we'll allow for people in the webinar to ask Q&A. You can also use the chat to raise questions, and for some of the questions and queries, we may try to answer them on chat also. As a quick background, as several of you who might be already working with the NDHM ecosystem know, the NDHM ecosystem has these terminologies that we use, health information providers to represent hospitals, diagnostic centers, clinics, or anybody creating health data and is willing to share it in the NDHM ecosystem. Typically, sharing happens by providing a link of the data that they hold with the health ID. Usually, they don't do it by themselves to enable this or achieve this. They usually partner with or use a software which is NDHM compatible. And usually these NDHM compatible software are either EMR or LMIS apps. And in fact, several EMR and LMIS apps have already cleared many of the milestones with the NDHM sandbox and know how to actually hold health data on behalf of a patient and how to also share that health data as an FHIR profile in the ecosystem. And then, of course, you have the NDHM building blocks themselves, like the health ID, the health professional registry, the health facility registry, and the consent manager. So one of the things that you'll notice is that to bring a better and more clarity to the term consent manager, we have now renamed it going forward into an health information exchange and consent manager. Simply because it's doing both of these functions, which is not just managing consents for a patient, but also allowing for health information to be exchanged. And finally, any entity that was requesting and using health information, we have been calling as a health information user. So any mobile app that the user wants to use to see your own data, of course, can act and must act also like a HIU. But outside of this, there is a second role that we have also implemented, for example, in the reference app called the NDHM PHR app, which is the ability for you to manage the consent of the user. So what we will be doing in today's session is going to be showing how, if you have your own mobile app that you want to share with your consumer base, how you can essentially handle consents using the NDHM HIMCE also within your own app. So please go to the next slide, Sukri. Here are some basic concepts that most of you may already be aware of. If you're not, you will need to also go and look up and read some of the sandbox documentation. But in terms of roles and responsibilities, health information providers or HIPs essentially do two things. Number one, whenever they have any health data for a user, they link that with the PHR address or basically a health ID that we call it with the health information exchange / consent manager so that it can be actually shared in the ecosystem. And second, whenever they get a request for sharing of data, they actually release the actual health record. So in the first step, they're only linking data, and in the second step, when they have the appropriate consent, they release the data. That's the role of the HIP. This is usually executed by using HRPs. So HRPs actually build the software that does it, but the legal liability and responsibility will continue to rest with the HIP. So what this means is that a single software from say a provider could support in a cloud hosted manner could support 10 hospitals. So the 10 independent hospitals are 10 HIPs, and that single software in the cloud would be called a HRP, which is supporting all these HIPs to essentially share data with their patients. Now, anybody who's getting hold of health data, as we already said, is called a HIU. And so HIUs can only get and they can store the data with consent. All of this is enabled by the Health Information Exchange and Consent Manager. So if you look inside the Health Information Exchange and Consent Manager, you will find two things. One, that the HIECM stores links. So it says, okay, for this PHR address, I have these links to various HIPs or HRPs which are holding the data. Two, it also keeps the consents and the statuses of a consent for a user. Now, a user in a HIECM environment is going to be referred by the term a PHR address. So we'll come to this. It's a term that we have renamed from health ID alias to a PHR address, and we'll also talk about a bit about why. And of course, the HIECM, as I said, facilitates the transfer of data from HIPs to HIU. Finally, we have also introduced the concept of lockers, and I think we had a previous webinar where we covered how people can implement lockers. And the role of a locker is primarily to store a copy of the patient's data from an HIP in a long-term storage, and two, to also be allow users to add any data, say from their Fitbits or other user-generated scan data to their locker, and also then have that shareable with other HIUs, like for example, their doctor and so on. So these are the various roles and entities that we have so far defined to be operational in the NDHM ecosystem. So, Kritik, next slide. So let's talk a bit about some of the changes that we are bringing out based on some of the learnings, experience in the pilot, and how we think this should evolve going forward. Currently, the architecture has a health ID system and has only one health information exchange and consent manager in the ecosystem. And currently, whenever somebody gets issued a health ID, they're automatically issued address on the NDHM HIECM. So, and usually we were calling this a health ID alias, like for example, Kiran MA at NDHM or Kiran MA at SBX was being called a health ID alias. So we have decided to term this a PHR address. And so going forward, that will be the reference that we will start seeing in most of our documentation in terms of this entity. Now, one of the policy decisions, and Sukrit, if you can just click next. One of the policy decisions that we have been working towards is to allow multiple HIECMs to be part of the ecosystem. So, like we have an at NDHM, so tomorrow there could be a Kiran MA at ABC or whatever else, where the at part of it would be like a domain, and so you would know which HIECM you are kind of dealing with. So before this is actually going to be introduced, NHA is planning and it's working on a consultation paper. So please expect that there would be a consultation paper, and fundamentally in the consultation paper, feedback would be sought on things like who should be allowed to operate a HIECM, what kind of APIs and standards to be followed, and other elements that would relate to this. But it's important for us when we are designing this to be aware that while NDHM HIECM is a consent manager, and today you will learn how you can actually integrate with this consent manager, in the future, it's not going to be the only consent manager in the ecosystem. And so, in some sense, while all consent managers will have a standard set of APIs specifically when it comes to linking of health data, transfer of health data, APIs like the ones that we are sharing today are not necessarily have to be a standard. So Sukrit, next slide, please. Yeah. So what you're going to see in today's session is about the various APIs of how you would actually integrate. So if you actually think about how do you build a mobile app that would be able to provide a comprehensive experience of managing health records for patients. We have on the right side, you can see there are three things that you would have to do. You would have to have a way by which you either register the patient or help the patient log in with a PHR address. And so you do that in the demonstrations today. You'll learn to do that using by interacting with the health ID system, using something that we are going to call as an OIDC flow, where you can actually allow an existing health ID to log in and get a user token. And second, you're also going to learn how you can use a set of APIs that we're going to show you today. Then these APIs, like I said, are specific to the NDHM HIE-CM. And of course, all of them require this user token that you're going to get from the health ID system to be able to manage different consent requests for the user. So that's the second thing that you'll learn. And the third part, which we are not going to talk about, which is part of once you are able to do these two, if you want to be able to fetch and display PHR data, those are done using an existing HIU API. So the documentation that we use for how to build a HIU and how you do that is exactly the same. So there is really no change in that particularly approach. Now, wanted to remind you all again that while these APIs that we are sharing with you are very specific, so in some sense, when you make this build today, you are deciding that your app will partner with the NDHM HIE and will essentially deal with that. But as multiple CMs come in the market, it is quite possible that those APIs may be slightly different or different from what we are showcasing today. I think before we get started, this is just a quick intro. If there are any questions just on this intro, we'll take them now. Otherwise, we'll get started with the technical details of these three things in today's session. So please use the raise hand feature. And if there are any queries at this point, we'll just take them. And this one, we'll keep it very short because we do not want to, we want to spend most of the time on the technical part of the session today. Thank you. Shrikant. Yeah, I see Shrikant first on the slide.
My query is quite a lot has been covered. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Shrikant.
Yeah. Quite a few sessions have been held before this. Are the recordings available for us? Because I have joined.
They're all webinar recordings are available on the Sandbox documentation website. Take a look at the section called webinars. You can find them.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Venu.
Yeah, Kiran, so you mentioned a consultation paper would come out.
Yeah.
Are there any tentative timelines on it?
Not really. We have a series of consultation papers. So NHA recently released 2 consultation papers for which there is time for feedback from all of you. The current 2 consultation papers are on the health professional registry and the health facility registry, and you can find them on the NDHM website. There is a there is an upcoming consultation paper on something called UHI. So this is likely to be the consultation paper after this. So I am expecting not less than 30 to 45 days. When.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. So
yeah, hi Kiran. Just a quick question. So as you know, we are designing the locker. So when we look at integrating the HIE-CM flows into that, is there any thought on how the so the reason I asked that, just to clarify, is that the PHR app gives a certain flow for the perspective. Do you see any kind of boundary conditions there on how when we implement the same on our platform, or we are free to choose the display, the user journey there?
I think did everybody get so it's anybody else? Sukrit, did you get Soit's question? Soit, could you repeat? You broke up a bit. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm on the road. So let me repeat. I was asking that as we look to integrate the HIE-CM APIs, is there any thought on how the user journey should also be, or that's completely left for us to design?
So that's the area that we would love to see some innovations.
Perfect.
We are providing the APIs at this point, but we think, there is a certain user journey that we have visualized and implemented as part of the NDHM reference app. But we really think that the market should try to innovate on the user journey side and how it actually handles this experience.
Sure. Because we had some thoughts which were slightly different from the PHR app. So just wanted to check that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nothing hard and fast in terms of that experience, as long as you perform all of the capabilities that we will discuss today. Right?
Sure.
All right.
Thanks.
So with that, let's jump into the technical details of how we actually want to achieve this. So Sukrit, Sukrit or Ashok, who's going to talk about the OIDC flow of the first step?
I'll
Sukrit,
talk about.
why don't you
I'll
go
start
ahead
talking
and then
about
Ashok,
it.
please
Yeah.
jump in if
Ashok
there are
can
any queries.
pitch in with any
I'll
queries.
just this on this one slide, I'll just quickly cover Sukrit. You can put into full slide mode. So generally, whenever we are starting with a mobile app implementation, it's already shared. Yeah. So when we are starting with a mobile app implementation, there are several mobile apps which may already have certain user information available with them. Like, for example, they may already know the mobile number, name, age, and gender of the user. So if you are such an app where you already have something, we would recommend that there are health ID APIs where you can actually do a search and see if this person already has an existing health ID. And if so, you then use that information to display it to them and allow them to actually log into their existing ID rather than going through a flow which is allowing them to create or register a new ID. So that's recommendation number one. Two, if the user does not have a health ID or a PHR address, we are going to allow the same OIDC flow that we are going to demonstrate to you for login to have a different action which is called register. Okay. So with which you can essentially, create allow the user to actually go create a health ID and a PHR address. And when you come back, you can now get access to that token and you can continue the process. And the third scenario that we're going to show you, which is what we're going to demonstrate to you now, is if the user already has an existing health ID, you can actually log in from your app using the OIDC flow. Go ahead, Supreet.
So moving on, I think Kiran partially mentioned these, but on a high level, these are the features that the current PHR app supports. One is view and share of profiles. So basically, that's user profile related information, discovery and linking of care contexts, and managing different kinds of requests. So on the app, you see the three major tabs on the bottom, where records is corresponding to the last point, which is viewing longitudinal health records. Providers tab is where essentially you can see your linked care contacts, and you can also discover and link health records. Request tab is where we currently manage our consent requests, locker setup requests, all the different types of requests that are there in the system. And on the top right hand side, there's the profile screen where one can go and see the profile details, share the profile by just scanning a QR code, things like that. Okay. But in order to do all that, first step is obviously the login bit. And that is where the OIDC comes in. So I'll quick, yeah. So I'll first demonstrate it on our PHR app, and then I'll just walk through the APIs and the documentation that we have. Still, it's something, instead of username and password, what you see here is something like a login with PHR address. This is like a login with health ID. And clicking on that, it goes to the health ID website itself, where as a user, you can choose to enter your health ID or the PHR address. Go with Sadio. So this logging in is actually happening on the health ID website itself. Log in with password. The user can choose to log in with OTP, or mobile OTP or Aadhaar OTP, depending on if they have that set up. Once I log in, I'm redirect to the PHR app, and it's the same PHR app is logged in, the same screen, only with differences. The login is similar to what is to an OIDC method. Right? So where can we find this documentation and the exact APIs that is invoked in the background? I'll just walk through those. So in the Sandbox documentation, I'll start from home. So there is this documentation tab inside which we have an implementer's guide. This is a new page we had added there called Building PHR App. Okay, so where we talk about the OIDC flow a bit. So a couple of things required for this is essentially you need to have a client ID with the OIDC role and a redirect URL. Why is this redirect URL needed? We'll come to that in a bit. And as of now, there is no API for you to create that automatically. So you can send an email and it will be processed. So once you have the role and everything set up, this is the first API that we need to call. Okay, so I have this copied. I'll just go to my Sublime and just show here. Okay. So it's a URL or an API on the health ID system for OIDC with a certain response type is code, and the client ID I'm using is my client ID. Okay. There is a redirect URL. Please note that this is the redirect URL that you registered with. So basically, if I try with any other redirect URL, it will not work. Okay. The action is login, and there is a state and scope. So what these things mean is well documented here. The client ID and redirect URL I've already spoken about. Scope is the information that the user wants access to. The action, which is login, and as Kiran mentioned, in future there might be something similar like to registration. A state is a random string that can be used to verify the request or match the request to the redirect responses. So what happens when I make this API call, make this call? So basically, I can make this call on any browser. It just takes me to the health ID login page where I can log in. Password again. Now, once I'm logged in, you see I am redirected to some website. So since I had configured my webhook URL as my redirect URL, that's what it called with the scope profile, the same state as was passed earlier, the same action and an access code. This access code is a temporary access code that can be used to converted into a user's login token. Okay, so there's an API for that on the health ID system as well. We'll go to that. So yeah, so there's an API called convert code to token, which takes in this access code. Okay, and if you see the header, it expects an authorization. So this authorization should be for the client that was used in the first URL. So since I used this client ID in the initial URL, so I need the access token for this same client to be used to convert this token to code to token. So yeah, I'm able to get a token here. Now this is a user's login token, and using this, I'll just put it in. Sorry. I'm able to get the user's token. Right? So I have an environment variable set, so I'll just change it back to. Now basically all our CM APIs that we demonstrate post this will work with using the same token. Okay, so I'll just change this to a variable that I have for easier access. So that's pretty much on the OIDC login mechanism bit. I'll go back to the Sandbox website and talk about the flow once. So what happened here? You see the initial call when I click on the login button on the PHR app, or I pasted the URL in the in my Google Chrome. I called an URL on. I hit the health ID server directly. I logged in there. The redirection happened, and then the patient entered the credential on the health ID system directly. After that, it makes an API call. Now, this API call to convert the code to token is via our PHR backend or CM backend. And this is because it needs the same client ID authentication in order to convert that was used for the first place. Right? So if this goes successfully, you get back a patient's access token. Now, all CM APIs use this patient access token. Okay, so that brings us to the end of OIDC bit, I would say, for today.
Yeah.
Any questions on this?
Yeah. Please feel free to ask any queries that anyone might have on the OIDC bit. We'll take questions on that before we move to the next topic in this session. Please go ahead, Suprakash Goswami.
Yeah, hi Kiran. So does this token has a time limit, like for 1 minute or 72 hours? Like, is there any time limit to the token?
Which token are you talking about? The logged in token?
Yeah.
So production, it's I think currently configured to 2 hours. It's configurable, but current value in production is like 2 hours. In Sandbox, I think it's much longer. So
yeah, maybe 72 hours or so. So there is a time limit, right? So
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Fine. Thank you.
Venu?
Yeah, hey, so thank you for this. So now that I have this token, can I use this on web also, or is this only for mobile?
It's for the APIs.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's for the APIs. We are not, it is quite possible that somebody might build a completely web interface. So there is nothing, both web and mobile interfaces. But right now it is, since what we know is we are aware that there are several integrators who've been wanting to do it on mobile apps.
Yeah.
So it is for mobile. But if somebody wants to build a self-service portal on web for users, I don't think there's any restriction in using it from the web. Ashok, this one on that?
No, that's perfectly fine.
So now what you have demoed is the code flow. So are you mandating code flow to be used everywhere, or client credential secret is also fine?
It will be code flow only as of now.
Okay, can we move to the next question? Binoy Bose.
Thank you, Kiran. My question is like whether this token is a JWT token and whether we can use this entire this OIDC flow for like the base authentication flow of our application, whether it's in web or it's in mobile, like without using any other authentication third-party provider. Like, can we use the same itself as an authentication mechanism for our own application?
So
Hello?
my only concern there would be as an auth mechanism in your application, this token means that a user has logged in. So if you think that is a good enough authentication for your APIs, I think there should not be any problem.
Okay. Yeah, thing is like if it is a JWT token, we can actually decode the token and we can check the subjects and we can use the user information to authenticate with our own APIs as well. Is there any concern or
it is
doing that?
Yeah, it is possible. However, in order to have the better security, because you may have some additional things on top, It is not advisable to directly use as is the same token, right?
Okay.
So it is better that you build your own authentication mechanism on top of it.
Okay, fine. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, I think on this section we don't seem to have any other questions. So I think, Sukrit, we can start the next part or the section of the webinar, please.
So once the user has logged in, things that they can do is, of course, view profile and share the profile details and set and update consent pin. So these are APIs currently on our consent manager. And let's have a look at where the API documentation is first. So like in all the other implementation pages, you'll find a link to the APIs over here. Okay. We have a for all the different sections, and then we have a grouping under account, which will give you access to which mentions these APIs like view profile details, share with HIP, and set consent pin, set or update. So yeah. So moving on to these APIs. So the view profile is something we used just now. It's the patient/me, the first one, the get profile. And go here. So it just uses this authorization, and that's pretty much it. You can get the user's profile. There is a field here called has transaction pin set. So this means, people who have used the system will be aware that there is a consent pin that is required to grant consent requests. And this is the field that determines whether the consent pin for this user is set or it needs to be set. The next feature is a simple share profile feature, which is on the top right corner of the NBHM PHR app. You see a scanner. So this essentially opens up a scanner, and as a user, you are expected to scan a QR code at a, say, registration counter in a hospital. Okay. So when you scan it, the content of that QR code is nothing but a health ID, sorry, not a health ID, an hospital ID or HIP ID and a code. The code can be any random string that the HIPs use. So essentially, in order to call this share API, all you need is a request ID, a random request ID, an HIP ID, and a code. Okay. So, and of course, authorization will be the user's token itself. Once we make this call, we see a success. Still, this means that my profile details was shared with this HIP, which is a reference HIP we have. And so behind the scenes, this is an asynchronous API for the HIP. Essentially, what happens is the gateway will call a shared profile on the HIP, and the HIP is expected to call back an on-share profile on the gateway. But for the PHR app or for the end user, this appears to be synchronous because we just have a timeout, like within 5 seconds, if the entire success loop is completed, we give a success, otherwise we give a timeout error. Okay. Okay. And the next section of APIs in here are the consent pin related APIs. Okay. So essentially, first is a verify pin. This is not really a profile feature, but wherever it's in, if a user you have a pin, you can verify. We'll see these being used when we grant consent requests. And the other profile, I'm not going into demonstration of these profiles, but these are pretty straightforward profiles that can be used to, say, set a pin or update a consent pin, right? The verification is one which is required for granting consent requests. So we'll see that in a bit. So that's pretty much on this profile related APIs. Any questions on that?
I think we can hold that. Yeah, we can hold that till just quickly. I think this was a very simple portion of this one, but any questions on it? Or everybody clear which APIs are used to handle the profile section? Bena, I presume you are done with your query. Yeah.
Yeah.
Suprakash?
Hi, Kiran, Suprakash. Thank you. So I have one question. So like consent pin, that if Sukrit can explain the consent pin once more, probably I missed that point. So if you don't mind, like that pin has to be set by
Yeah,
the
yeah.
user itself, right?
Yes.
So,
Right.
Yeah. So it's a pin. So basically, when a user grants a consent request, just being logged in is not good enough. We expect them to verify it using the consent pin. Okay. And as a user, you can set the consent pin with your consent manager. So there is this API you see here, contation/pin, which is to create a transaction pin. So this is the one which we expect them to call for the very first time when I'll go back to the API. If the has transaction pin in false, that means the consent pin is not set and the user can set it. Okay, and if it is set, it will be true. Now, once the consent pin or the transaction pin is set, that is required whenever the user grants a consent request. So we will demonstrate that in some time, but that is the purpose of this pin. So just quickly to show before the demonstration, if you
So
see the
that means if I got it correctly, if the consent pin set to true, that means any information regarding that users, if any third party or any service provider want to get that information, he need to put the pin from the users. That is, am I correct?
not a third party. If as
Anyone.
part of no. So typically, if you remember the flow is something like there could be a consent request from some hospital which says, I want access to Sukrit's health records. In which case, Sukrit will get a notification which says, hey, hospital X is requesting access to your health records. So that is your consent artifact, so to speak.
Right.
When Sukrit says, okay, I'm happy to grant the consent, our APIs require, apart from him having been authorized as a user, additionally a consent pin also from the user.
Right.
I hope that's clear. So that and when you see the consent grant APIs, you will understand this a little better. But just be aware that a consent pin is requisite as part of the APIs. I hope that helps.
That part, Kiran, that part is very clear to me. But my point is, when you're making the consent pin set to true or false, right?
That's
the user profile information.
The profile is just telling you whether the user has already selected a consent pin or not.
Right.
And if the user has not selected a consent pin, the PHR app can help him select a consent pin.
Right.
If the user has already selected a consent pin, then that consent pin will need to be used.
Exactly. So that means if the consent pin set to be false, first the user had to set that consent pin
very
true.
first time,
Right.
very first time, you will need to help the user select a consent pin.
Consent, right. That is my question. Thank you very much for clarifying. Thanks, Kiran. Thanks, Sukrit. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Ronak, please go ahead.
Yeah, so just building on top of this, so if I set my consent pin to be true, so if I've gone to say a provider A, tomorrow if I go to provider B, this consent pin has to be then explicitly given to this provider as well to be able to see my records, or is it one time for?
You don't share the consent pin with providers as such. So it's your profile information. So basically, it's like another password you can say, and you will have to put it in whenever you are granting a consent request.
Okay. Okay. So essentially, when
Thanks. I hope that is clear, Ronak.
Yeah, so essentially when I'm scanning, it is I'm implying the fact that I'm giving my consent pin for booking an appointment and sharing my records with that particular provider, whichever has been
when
registered.
you do a scan profile.
Yeah.
Yeah. So right now, if you look at our PHR app implementation, we don't use the consent pin in that context.
Right.
So when you're scanning the profile, there is no real health records being exchanged. Only your health ID is being given to a health facility, right?
Yes, yes.
So as part of that, the only expectation is to educate the user that this is happening. So even in our PHR app, we are now going to do before the share happens. So let us say I went to a facility and I scanned a QR code that was pasted at the facility. On my PHR app, a pop-up is expected. In the pop-up, what information is being shared has to be shown. and a small purpose. So the purpose is a generic purpose because, you know, when you're sharing a health ID with,
which is the linking bit of things, right? That the my
yes. Yeah. So the generic purpose says that, you know, by sharing this health ID, your health ID with this facility, you understand that the health ID will use this to share and will use this to share your health records with you, right?
Right.
So that's all the thing does, Ronak.
Okay.
Whereas when you're granting a consent to Tata Memorial Hospital or some other hospital to get access to your health records, you have a lot more control because you can say which records, for how long they can keep it, and so on, right?
That is the other distributed flow driven.
That's the
from
other, yeah. The
provider.
consent pin is required in those contexts,
right?
Not in the share profile context. I hope that's clear.
Yeah. So if in case Tata Memorial is requesting a health record for me, that is when the consent pin kicks in because
Correct.
I get like if I have 5 records, I can give it distributed access as well. That I only want to share 1 to 3 records, not 4 and 5.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ron. Venu?
Yeah, so now that OpenID is provisioned, so do we need the linking token to generate to link the records?
Not in this side. See, that is on the HIP side. Remember?
Yeah.
The linking token construct is basically, let us say I am a facility. I am not using OIDC there, right? So let's say I am a patient, or some patient came to my facility. That patient simply scanned the QR code that I pasted on my counter.
Okay.
So what happened in the share profile that you just saw is the mobile app essentially called an API on the consent manager saying, please share the health ID, ID profile with this particular HIP. So the consent manager says, okay, this HIP's endpoint or this HIP software is here because it knows that. And it essentially pushes the health ID to you, right? So you, in essence, get a verified health ID.
Right.
On your side, we currently in the share profile, we have not included the linking token. It is one of the
share is fine. Share is fine.
So, but therefore, no, just let me finish this. So what that means is in the share context, while I have got a health ID in my software at the facility side, I still need to generate a linking token using demo currently. Okay. But in the future, we are also considering whether a linking token should be automatically pushed as part of the share profile so that we can reduce one call. I hope that's clear.
Yeah. So it actually resolves a lot of async calls. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So what is the other scenario, Venu?
No, that's the scenario I was talking. So like, so because this is digital health, you can book an appointment, walk into the hospital, then an encounter is created. Then done, linking is created.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. That's also the intent. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Pramod.
So my question is actually a use case. Now with this mechanism, is it possible that me as a patient wants to send a particular image, a record, an imaging record, where one end I have my radiographer or the radiologist, and at the other end is my family doctor. And I'm sitting at home and I want to connect the two of them to discuss a particular lesion found in my chest X-ray. So does this mechanism handle that?
I mean, all of whatever you're saying is absolutely possible on the NDHM architecture, but somebody has to still build that base software or the software for the participants. Your job, I mean, so there is absolutely, Dr. Pramod, I don't see any concerns with the use case that you're providing.
If my application does that where I can ping my family doctor and ping my radiologist, the NDHM architecture does allow that image to be seen by both of them simultaneously, geographically in different locations, without me being present in either of those locations.
This is like, for us that it's like on wherever your radiologist is sitting is the HIP, since he has generated the diagnostic image. You as a patient are the consent provider. So your family doctor is the HIU in this scenario, where he's saying, I want to get access to Pramod's records. So when he says, I want to get access to Pramod's records, as long as Dr. Pramod or you provide the consent, Pramod, the content can move from the diagnostic lab to your family doctor without any problems.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So let's, there are no more questions on this topic, guys. So Sukrit, we can move to the next portion of this webinar. Thank you.
So the next portion brings me to the providers tab on the PHR app, from where we can link care context. So now for people who have been using the PHR app, the first step that we of course do before we get the data is basically link providers. Now there is a construct of HIP initiated linking. It still happens at the HIP, no change, nothing. This has nothing to do with that bit, but this is just more the patient initiated linking, where instead of the HIP linking it, patient tries to discover health records present at the hospital and link it to their own health ID or PHR address, right? So the steps are simple. One needs to search an HIP, then they can discover, and then the link. Okay. And we have the corresponding APIs for that as well. So
Sukrit, demo it once on the app if you don't mind before you
just
go to API.
So here I can just link a provider. I can search, say, a hospital. I'll search with Max Healthcare NDHM because I have some records there. And I'll fetch records. I see. So this is the discovery bit. Now, post this, I can go and link. Once I click on link, what happens is OTP will be sent. So I want to do the linking bit from the app because I cannot undo the linking as of right now if I do it.
Yeah, so don't do the link, but yeah, I hope this flow is clear. So let's start to see how the APIs work under the hood to enable this.
So first thing we want to mention is if you see this screen, we have the search API under the hood, which is some sort of a registry. Now, as of right now, it's a CM API, but the future plan is there will be some registries that will do all these, maybe probably handle more in a much better way. But currently, this is being served from our gateway or which knows about all the HIPs. So I go to the API section here. If you see the discovery API, there is a providers, and this is the API that is used, which takes in a state code and a district code, which is optional, and of course, an user token. So providers. So here is the API. It headers is just a user authorization, and one can search providers. Once the provider is searched, you see a provider ID being returned, and of course the details of the provider and some additional attributes that providers may have. Okay. So I'm not sure if it's set up. I'll just try to show a quick example of an additional attribute. So you see an additional attribute set here is a HIP attribute, which is a CoWIN registration number. This is just an example. What I'm saying is this is what this additional attributes can be leveraged for, where on this page, on this screen, instead of patient ID, it will show CoWIN registration number in case of COVID.
In this version, can you click on the government thing, or you can just show it to them? Go back.
So here.
Yeah. Please continue, Sukrit.
Yeah. So the first step, as we saw, the user searches the facility and they get the facility ID. So I use the facility where I have data, which is Max, and then is the discover flow. So the body it accepts is just a HIP ID. Okay. and the header is a user authorization. Now, people who have implemented HIPs and would know that there is this Discover API is actually on the HIPs. Again, just like the share profile one, this API is a synchronous API, a wrapper on top of the asynchronous discovery APIs calls between the gateway and the HIPs. So essentially, when this call is made, it internally makes a call to whichever HIP is provided. The HIPs need to respond back with the list of care context, and that is what is shown to the user. Okay, so the HIP says these are the care contexts, reference number, some deep for the patient. So this is the patient reference at the hospital. This is the care context reference. This is the second care context and has some reference. And it says what is it matched by. Okay. So that's the discovery bit. Then comes linking. Again, linking is a two-step process right now, and it requires an additional auth. So the expectation here is this is a link init call. So user on the PHR app, if you go, so on the PHR app, it is displayed after discovery, and user can choose, right? So based on what the user chooses, the link init should be triggered. So it should have a transaction ID, which is based on the discovery request that we get here. Okay, so it's parameterized, so it will automatically be a part of this API. A request ID, a patient reference. Now this patient reference again is this one, what is passed, the patient's reference in the discovery call, and a care context reference. Okay. So last time, if I go back to the discovery, here I see that these are the two available care contexts. So I can link one or both, or initiate the linking for one or both. We'll do it for one. So it has been initiated, and it says that OTP has been sent to this mobile number, which is mine. Please note, this is a responsibility of the HIP to send this OTP to this number, right? So, and it's like you can think of it as a second auth happening or a two-factor auth happening at the HIP side. HIP matched by the consent manager ID or mobile phone number, whatever they had, but they just want to revalidate before they actually link. So I'm just waiting for the SMS. Once I get the OTP, I need to call the confirm with a link reference number. Now the link reference number is again, which comes in from here, the link / reference number. So we have actually tests, so I don't have to copy it, it's auto-populated. And the token, which will be my OTP. It gives a success and it is linked. How do I validate that it is linked? So this screen is where I can see the link. See, previously there was just one, now there are two. Okay. Now for the, this is the UI. From an API, we also have an API for the same, obviously, which will be a links API. So for a given patient, based on the authorization, it will list down all the links. So this says it has a link from two links. So it has link from one HIP and it has two care contexts. So a couple of things to note here. One is on the Sandbox, the state and district. Okay, there are APIs to get these are standard codes, and we have util APIs that can give you the list of state and districts. basically from where you can get the codes. But on the Sandbox currently, it doesn't work because the actual metadata against HIPs are missing. So once we have that, it shouldn't be a problem. So that brings to the end of all the provider discovery and linking related APIs. So quick 5 minutes for questions before we move on to the next section.
Hey, Shukrit, Suprakash here. So the linking is for, I'm not sure whether the linking would be the right term here or not, whether the association would be the right term, but if I'm linking some multiple service providers information to a single PHID, right? The patient ID.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. That is what.
So the simplest way to understand this is that PHR ID does not have any health data. It simply has a bunch of links, which we call as care contexts. And these links essentially point back to a HIP. So they say there is this HIP and he has certain records for you. And there are two ways in which a PHR address could be linked with a care context. One is called a HIP initiated linking, which is you go to a facility, you share your health ID, and the facility basically links that with your health ID. Right after any general, right, or PHR address, right after your record is generated. The second scenario, which is what this discovery flow is for, is for the scenario where you go to a health facility, but you do not share your health ID. So let's say, for example, and many facilities have been maintaining records also for many, many years in the past. Like Apollo tells me that they have been maintaining records for almost up to 10 years, right? So when Apollo comes online in the NDHM network, when that's expected shortly, you will be able to use a PHR app, go to the discover providers thing, type the Apollo facility that you went to, share your name, age, gender, mobile number, and in that little box that this one showed below, you could probably say put the Apollo's registration number if you have any of their printouts, right? And then Apollo will use this information to search whether there is any records for you. And if so, they will send back a bunch of care contacts saying, yes, I found something for you.
Right.
And you are then allowed to link it to your health ID. So this is how we hope to have what you can call as stock and flow. Typically, these are the terms that's used, right? So older records can also become part of the ecosystem.
Understood.
And new records as and when they're generated are also part of the ecosystem. I hope that helps answer the question.
Absolutely. So as a patient, say I'm from the patient context, say I'm a person who is residing in Bangalore, I'm treating in say Manipal Hospital. Then since last 5 years, then I moved to suppose Chennai and I went to the Chennai Apollo. And now I already linked my patient information, which the sources or the provider is Manipal. They have added, they've linked my information into my ID. And then when I went to Apollo, I said, okay, fine. I already have or whatever you want to please link my information, statement information into my ID. They will allow the same process. They will follow and they will link those information to this. So multiple information can be linked to a single the patient ID or PHR ID. So that is the exact
that's exactly how NDHM works. Yeah,
exactly. And just to follow question to that, so is it a compulsion by regulation that all the health service providers by so and so year they have to be NDHM compliance? Though
no.
it's a different question
Yeah.
altogether.
No, it is not. So NDHM at this point is currently voluntary.
Okay.
And providers, patients, all the participants need to decide that this is valuable for them for whatever their reasons, business or otherwise, to participate. So that's one of the adoption challenges actually, because we are looking for strong use cases that drive why people want to use this adoption layer. There are no regulatory pushes to kind of make this happen. Dr. Pramod, do you still have a question? I see your hand up.
No, actually, now that you brought it up, let me just ask one more scenario then, because this helps adoption if it works, right? So the other scenario I would like to ask you is that we are talking of the same image record, which now has to be simultaneously seen by my family doctor, the radiologist, and the cardiologist simultaneously, and they hold a medical sort of video conference. But preferably the image is not being sent across, only a link is being sent across, which can be accessed through a DICOM viewer to see that image in the radiologist's PAC system. Would this be also possible, in assuming they have the DICOM viewers which work for them?
So one of the areas that we haven't still, and we're still, as you might be aware, Dr. Pramod, working on some very specific guidelines is for management of very large images like CT scans. So sharing and management of large records like CT, MRI, X-rays, and so on. But the thinking is like this, right? For very large files, it does not seem to be prudent to request the HIP to hold that record for say 10, 15 years, like we are asking for other records, because these are definitely very heavy. So it is quite likely that these kind of records will be held for shorter periods of time. And in that shorter period of time, it would be expected that the user can, if he wants this heavy full resolution file, that's a DICOM PACS file that can be viewed, that he would take a copy of it into his own health locker. And this idea of this, link from a health locker to be viewed by a DICOM viewer could be something that runs off something like the locker.
Okay, so there is a mechanism that might actually work for that, because that will improve the adoption and the power of what this can.
No, without doubt, we think this is an important use case. And so, in fact, I had requested a few other volunteers to help us also address how well and in fact actually demonstrate this particular use case, since there are several diagnostic labs, smaller diagnostic labs in India, and physicians who want access to the full record don't necessarily have it. So, and this could be one of the values of use cases of NDHM for sure. So thank you, Dr. Pramod. Venu?
Yeah, so will lockers also use the health ID, or because right now they're issuing their own ID?
No, they don't issue their own ID even today, Venu. So lockers, the way, if you don't mind, Sukrit, can you just go to the profile page and show the locker setup portion? So locker setup works directly with the health ID. You basically go to your profile in our PHR app, and you can just say select a locker. So when you are selecting a locker, your health ID is sent to that locker, and then the locker, like in the OIDC, the locker guys decide, whatever they want to do in terms of signing up, and your health ID and then your consent information and all of that is managed through that. So you can read up or look at that locker documentation of portion.
That sign up with locker is like, so they will issue their own ID, isn't it?
They don't have to issue their own ID. Because what the locker is always against a health ID.
Yeah.
It is possible that
the locker
provider response, but yeah.
Okay. Now, one of the question I was asking you on the chat is about privacy. Okay. So right now we are sharing records with HIU, and that's a lot of concern. Okay, and a heartburn. Now, if the HP ID, the health professional ID, is also made as an open ID, then it could be seen as an extension to not share with HIU but share with the right people.
Yeah, it's a valid, absolutely valid viewpoint, Venu. And like I said, this is not a. See, the reality is that maybe you have a viewpoint that a health record should be seen only by a doctor, right? But in a healthcare scenario and in many other scenarios, like let's say, for example, we take an insurance processing use case. So an insurance processor is also a HIU. So it is not necessary that the person processing the claim is only going to be a doctor, but he does require access to some of those records for that purpose to verify that you indeed required the treatment or not. So the reality is that the usage of health information is still an evolving area in terms of what are the various use cases. And before, say, a broad policy which says nobody can access except A, B, or C comes out, I think it's important to have the viewpoints of the ecosystem players who actually use this data as we kind of refine the policy. So definitely two areas that I think as NDHM evolves, right now we are talking about plumbing and moving the data around. But as this evolves, the likely discussion is going to go into two areas, right? So one, what are the purposes of consent that should be allowed or not allowed for various types of players? This has not been something that's widely discussed. And second, even if I'm sharing this data, who potentially within that ecosystem has access? All of these kind of discussions, I think, are likely to come as it evolves. But fundamentally, I think we have to go. As you know, PDP bill also doesn't exist today. So any records or anything that you're sharing is really with whatever knowledge that is awarded by the current IT Act and other protections that are available for all of us. So this is a topic that, like I shared on the chat, also needs to evolve. So I hope that helps answer your question for now. But there is no right answer to this either.
Okay.
It is something that we all as a country have to agree to at some point and work with. Can I go to the next question, Hemant?
Hi, my question is there any HIP API that allows user to unlink the care context from PHR app?
Not on the HIP side. User can unlink, not the HIP.
Okay. So which API?
So you're saying if HIP has initiated a link and then user wants to unlink, right?
Yeah.
Sukrit?
No, so there is no API right now, but that is definitely something that will be there. Like it's there in the backlog.
Okay. So we are not in the current published, we are not published the unlink part, right?
No, the unlink API is not there. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
But just for the correction, I think it will be how Kiran mentioned it. It won't be an HIP API, but something for users to unlink.
It's a consent management API. Yeah, it's a consent manager.
Exactly.
Binoy?
Hi, Kiran. I'm looking for a little more clarity that Dr. Pramod put into scenarios, right? And I just trying to combine both, in fact. So I have a radiologist and I have a doctor and I am the patient. And I have a DICOM file, which is from a PAC system, which is very huge in size, maybe 10 GB or more than that. So I took it and I kept in my locker. So how shall I share that information with the HIU, that means the doctor?
Yeah, so this is like I said, if you use the way it is done right now, you would actually do a full transfer of the 10 GB to the HIU. That's how it would work today.
Okay.
So from a locker, you can share it with any other HIU. There is no problem there. That part of the APIs and the flow works. But the way it works today is it would try to transfer the full 10 GB file, not a link.
Okay, so
this is something where, So this is the area, like I said, that we need to come up with. It is actually possible to just send a link, but then that needs to be standardized if everybody is able to use it, or we need to at least agree on a certain approach to that. So that's something that has not yet been published for these large files. I hope that answer is clear.
The API standard supports publishing links as well. They just need to download it, but it very much depends on if the HIUs are actually using that. I don't think they're doing that, but the standard API does support sharing of links.
Okay, so the HIU will receive a link that points to the DICOM file that I kept in the locker.
That can be one of the methods in which it can be implemented. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Locker will have to host it temporarily, and the link can be used to download it.
They have to download. The link will expire. Like then the HIU has to manage himself.
Yes, exactly. All those has to be managed.
Shukrit, if I can come in.
Yeah, please.
So actually the FHIR specifications allow it. If you look into the NDHM FHIR specs, you will see in the profiles, there is also inclusion of an imaging study. Using this, you can either do as an attachment, what Kiran explained, which is transferring the DICOM file itself, and you just pass the necessary headers, and it depends on the receiver's capability about how to show the image. But imagine if you do not want to pass it as an attachment, you can create an imaging study, right? And typically the convention is like, you send an URL, which is like, WADO, one specific DICOM protocol, this thing, and yeah. And then I'm not sure whether the PHRF allows it, but once you receive it, you can just call typical WADO protocol to the endpoint that you have expressed this imaging study, and you can render it on the client device.
Okay. Okay, so the locker is responsible to generate the WADO URL.
Right. So if the locker right now, like, wants to extend that capability, it means like, it must have a DICOM server, like, supporting WADO protocols, right?
Okay, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I should also, thanks, Ansuman, that's absolutely right. Right now, we have not put any such requirements for locker implementers. And like I said, this is an area that we are quite keen for first some kind of a POC also to be done and demonstrated maybe within a few players. If some parties are interested, please reach out to us. We'll be very happy to, because it's also important to showcase some of these things in action and make sure that they work. And theoretically, all of us have these ideas that this is how it should work. But we are, of course, looking for feedback and input on this process.
Okay. Yeah. One more thing, like the radiologist is actually HAP, right? So he can actually annotate something, some observation on the DICOM image, and so, like simply that observation alone can be shared with an HIU.
Anshuman, do you know the answer to this one?
Yeah, absolutely. You can just pass on the annotation, notes, comments as well without like, passing on the, like, the DICOM images or the imaging studies. Absolutely. That's
but
possible even today.
That observation or the annotation is not stored in the locker. It is still with the HAP, I mean the radiologist.
Right. So it depends on what is the, remember, locker doesn't have the capability of modifying any data, right? It only keeps a copy of the original data. So it will always depend on what is the HIP sent.
No, my question is like no, my question is different. Like I don't want the locker intermediate. Like,
okay,
the annotation doesn't go to the locker. The locker just has a DICOM. The observation is an annotation from the radiologist. Like by looking into DICOM image, the radiologist annotate that there is a like pneumothorax or pneumonia.
Yeah, so there might be ways. So there might be ways, but this is probably a longer discussion, because you can actually source the data from multiple sources. So for example, you get the data from the locker, which is the DICOM image. You get the observation from the HIP. Now, there is a correlation that can be maintained through which you can say, okay, these annotations are for, this DICOM study. So, but it's probably more technical. We can probably take it on the dev forum.
Yeah, of course. I just like, okay, that's fine. I was just looking like whether this annotation only can be shared to the HIU, because the doctor may not need to see the DICOM file.
Might request this go. This is let's stick with the PHR flow today. Okay. We have still quite a bit to cover in the remaining 41 and 5 minutes.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks. Shrikant?
My question was related, and if it is not in line, please reject it.
Let us. I suggest that for large files is a definite topic, and if it's of interest, like I said, POC discussions. Happy to start a thread on this on the dev form and take that forward.
The question is as follows. When I collect, let's say I'm a patient and I collect my DICOM files, why can't I get the annotations along with it and put it in my locker? Why do I have to see? I'm the owner of the data, so I should have the right over whatever the radiologist or whatever records the hospital or the HIP, as you call it, has created. So I can pick all of it and put it in my locker. HIP has no right whatsoever over that data, is my understanding, when you say that the patient is the owner of the data.
No, we don't ever say patient is the owner of the data, neither does the PDP bill. The word ownership, if you actually read the PDP bill, it doesn't use the word owner, right? So when a doctor writes a prescription, the doctor can have a position. It's my patient. I've written this prescription. This is my data. It's not that he can't say that. And the patient can say, you've written about me, therefore it's my data. So we don't typically talk about ownership. We typically talk in terms of what rights do you have. PDP bill typically talks in terms of what rights do you have as an individual when some other entity, which typically is a data fiduciary as per the PDP bill, has certain information about you. So that's how it's usually defined in the PDP bill. We will please park this discussion to a different forum. It's definitely an interesting discussion, but not for today. Sukrit, we'll request you to go to the next tab and talk about the requests portion of building the PHR app. Thank you.
So currently on the bottom right, we have this request tab, and on the PHR app, I can just go here and see the different requests that I might have. Okay, so as a user, from the construct standpoint, currently there are 4 kinds of requests. Mainly, one is an authorization request, a consent request, a subscription request, and a locker setup request. And users can, of course, approve them, deny them, and in some cases get details maybe after the approval also. Right. So let's go into them one by one. All different types of requests are visible in the request tab, and so here you can see different like subscription request, auth request, even if a locker setup request all comes in. Okay. So let's go to auth requests. So auth requests can be created by HIPs or HIUs, and it is like for them to purpose can be KYC and or link. So basically, if the purpose is KYC, the user details is shared. If the purpose is link, a linking token is shared with the HIPs. For HIUs, link doesn't make sense. It has to always be KYC, and the patient needs to approve it. The creation part is, of course, outside the PHR app, right? The HIP or HIU system will be doing that. So now I'll just go and see how do we do checks. First API that I'll look at is how do we get all these requests. So yeah. So inside the account section, we have a API that gives all the requests. So patient/request, which gives you all the requests for a patient. Okay, and it can have subscription requests, authorization requests, locker setup requests. Okay, so let's have a look at this API directly. I have a few requests set up for this user, so I'll just call that. Okay, there are various statuses supported, which is, say, I'll put in all for now. So if you see, there are consents, subscriptions, authorizations, and locker setup. Okay. So a consent is a simple consent request. Now this is an expired one. Subscription request. For subscriptions, we will come. Expired is an authorization request. You see here, this user has a requested authorization for the purpose of KYC and for a requested here is a HIU. Okay. So any HIUs and HIPs can create this. Okay. And as a user, I can go and approve it from the PHR app. Here I can go in either approve or deny. Right. So the API for getting this request, although is a combined one, in the individual approvals and denials are separate APIs. And also please note one thing, this API is paginated, but at an individual level. So if you see, consents has a size and a limit and an offset, right? So individually consents and all the subparts like a consents and authorizations and subscriptions within the API can be paginated. Okay, so I don't think this is a valid auth request that I have, but let's try approving this. If it doesn't work, I'll create another. So I copy the auth request ID, okay, and grant auth. So the API documentation, although this is for all, okay, the individual approval APIs are available here. You can say approve a auth request. This is for revoke. Okay. And then deny and approve are the ones that are called on this UI. Then a patient can choose to approve or deny, and revoke can be done later. So we'll go ahead and approve it. So all I need to pass is and approve. The header requires the patient's authorization. The body, there is a thing called generate perpetual token, which is true. So this field doesn't really matter when the approval is happening for a HIP and HIU. This is only valid for lockers. Okay. So you can just ignore this. So my auth got approved. Now let's I'll go back just to showcase. If you see, this is a webhook that I had set up for the HIP that I used. So I got an auth notification that the auth was granted, a token has been created, and the requested detail and the user details as well, right? Because my purpose was KYC and link. Okay, now, so basically currently HIPs are doing mobile auth based approvals. That's what it was started with, but we have a mechanism of direct auth, which is nothing, this one, which can be approved from the PHR app and the details is shared. Okay. So let's move on to the next bit, next kind of request rather. It's a consent request, right? So consent requests are created by HIUs to access patient data. Okay. Of course, the patient would have to approve it, and I'll just add it here with a consent claim, right? That's what we were talking initially about. Okay. Now, once a consent request, this is the point I want to discuss a bit here. So once a consent request is approved, there may be one or multiple consent artifacts created. Okay. And now what exactly is a consent artifact? It is something, it can be considered as a contract between which the HIP and HIU transfer the data to the HIP. Now, why are there multiple consent artifacts? We will get into that and how it looks like. Okay. So going back to the list all, I can change the status. Okay, these are all the different values. By default is 0 to 5, and you can paginate it if you are expecting more records. I will put it as requested. Okay. So I have no consents, which is requested. What I'll do is I will use the HIU UI that we have to create a request. I put an older date because I have a bit older data here. So the request has been sent. We should be able to see it on the PHR app. Yeah, you see there is a consent request. Oh, by the way, the auth request is no longer visible here because it's not there. It is there in the approved section. You can see the consent request. So now if I make this API call, you will see there is a requested state consent. for the purpose of care management. This is the patient, the HIP. Now, as a user, I need to approve this. So list up that, open up that API as well. So in order to approve, first thing that I need is the consent request ID. I'll get it from there. But if you see, it's not a simple approve like auth. It expects us to pass all the details, including the HI types, permissions, data eraser, everything that was passed as a part of the consent, everything that is a part of the consent request, right? And the reason it is like this is because users have the ability to decide what to share and what not to share. So we have mentioned this previously in the HIU webinar as well. Doesn't matter what the HIU raises the consent for. Ultimately, it is the user, what the user approves is what you have consent for. So as a HIU, I can raise a consent for, say, from 2012, but user while approving can say always change it. I don't want to give it from 2012, it will just be from 2015, right? So, and a list of care contexts for an HIP. So if you see the list here, there is no HIP. That means the consent request created by the HIU doesn't know what the HIP is. They can, of course, choose to create it for a particular HIP, but they can also, since they are not aware, it's okay that they can create it without any HIP, right? So but we cannot approve a consent request without an HIP, because a consent request means that data from HIP will be shared with the HIU, right? Once it's approved. So the way you can see what are the HIPs available or what are the care contexts available for this patient is using the list API that we saw a little while ago, the patient/links. So this will give me that, okay, these are the, this is the HIP, these are the care contexts, okay, and I can just copy these. So I can approve it for the same care context. Okay. And on the UI again, you can see a user can always choose to edit whatever they want. And here the last section, see, this section is from the consent request, of course, but the last section is actually coming in, being populated from the links. So, okay. Now comes to the authorization, the consent, this doesn't expect a patient's authorization token, but a verification of the consent pin. So we have an API to verify the consent pin. So here it is, the documentation is present here for both of these things. Okay. So as we discussed, the verify pin, just using that, it expects the pin and the scope for which you are actually generating the temporary token. And this expects the patient's login token. So I run it, I get a temporary token. This temporary token is something I'm storing in pin authorization as a variable, and that is the one I'm using here in the header. Okay, so let's try and approve this. Request patient reference not specified. So I missed a scope. Go back, see what I missed. Try this again. Oh, bad. The care context reference expects a patient reference as well as a care context reference, right? I copied from the links. So the link is what is giving us just a link reference and a display. So I need the link reference. So I have the care context references and the patient reference in the link. I can see it here. Here, okay, the reference for the patient. Okay, so I'll use the same token. Okay, token verification fail, and this would have expired. So generate it again. Yeah, now it's granted. And you see a consent, I get an ID inside consent. So let's just look at this body once. This consent is an array, right? And what we approve inside this becomes one consent artifact. So basically, if a patient has care context from two different hospitals, say for example, I have data from Apollo and Max, which I wish to share with my local physician. The way I approve the consent, ideally, it should result in two artifacts, one for Max and one for Apollo, wherein every detail can be modified by the user, but the HIP, the one artifact will always be for one HIP. Let's go back here. See, now this has been granted, and now it's expected that the HIP should share the data with the consent, with the HIU. Okay, let's so a few other let's take a pause here before moving on to the next section. Any questions? Anyone?
Yeah. Any questions on what Sukrit has been discussing so far?
Just to add, there are additional, sorry, just one second.
Go ahead, Benoit.
There are additional APIs like consent requests, where you can list all the artifacts, or you can say list artifacts for a given consent request. So not covering those APIs, but those are simple GET APIs where you can essentially pass in the consent request ID and get all artifacts for that. Or maybe the deny or revoke one, where you just pass in the consent artifact and you can revoke it like that.
Okay.
Yeah,
my question.
Sure.
Yeah, because it's an explicit flow, like the HIU actually initiate the consent. So like whether the patient can implicitly give the information with consent to the HIU from an HIP.
As of right now, patients cannot implicitly give the consent like in this format, but there is a construct of an auto approval policy that can be set up for a given HIUs, which we'll talk in some time.
Okay.
But I think that's not the question. Benoit, your question is like, if I know my doctor, can I send him my health records like I do, like a forward on WhatsApp? Is that your question?
And it's not just been WhatsApp in the ecosystem of NDHM itself, could be.
Yeah. Actually, we are. See, for the end party or the receiving party to be ready to be able to get the health records, right now we are not foreseeing a push. But I don't, Anshuman. I mean, there is nothing which says where the consent request should it always must originate from a HIU. Is it there?
I mean, it must. Yeah, it must come from an HIU. How? Remember, we also talked about whether OIDC can be used essentially to say get a approval. So and that potentially, that flow is not there. That potentially can be one way, which will reduce this like
So,
in a back and forth.
Benoy, what I would request you is if you have a very specific use case scenario in mind that you feel must be supported and is not possible with the current APIs or architecture, if you can raise it, we'll be quite happy to debate it and see how we can
It's not about. I asked you why because the telemedicine policy published in 2020 by Ministry of Health and Niti Aayog specifies that they first consult with a registered medical practitioner should be considered as an implicit consent to share the health records. So that's how it is mentioned there. So that's why I asked that.
Which document are you referring to, Benoy?
Like the telemedicine policy published on 2020.
Oh, the telemedicine guidelines, is it?
Yeah, exactly that one. So it says that the first consult is an implicit consent from the patient. So there should be any new like a consent process explicitly initiated from the HIU, maybe from the doctor. So that's why I asked that, because I am trying to develop a telemedicine application. That's why.
Sure. So see, look, within NDHM, we do not recognize, and even the upcoming personal data protection policy does not talk about implicit consents. It actually, consents have to be explicit, and consent, this construct of the consent artifact, as well as the construct of a consent manager, are all part of also the upcoming PDP bill. So if you have a few minutes, take a read through the personal data protection bill, and you will get a better sense of this particular consent architecture. There is also a paper that's been published by NITI called the DAPA paper, and you will be also be able to find some references to these ideas there.
Okay, which one? Last question.
Bharat?
Which one? Which is the link you like document you mentioned last one?
Niti Aayog /DAPA. I'll put the link on the chat in a minute.
Okay, that will be good. Thank you.
Yeah, Bharat,
Sure.
please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kiran. Yeah, my question is to Sukrit. Sukrit, you mentioned that to actually approve a consent request, HIP ID is mandatory and it should not be null. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, since in this particular scenario, if a particular HIU is requesting for a bunch of documents from the patient who has stored it in a personal health locker, if he has to share the data from his health locker to the HIU, how would that scenario work with the HIP value?
So health locker in turn is an HIP from a construct standpoint. So the ID can very well be the health locker ID, the HIP ID for the health locker.
So the health locker should be registered as a HIP in the NDHM construct?
Health lockers internally are HIPs anyways. So basically, as I mentioned, the links API, if you remember, if your health data is with a health locker, the links API will return that as well. So you can use that to populate the HIP ID for the locker.
Yeah, but lockers are special entities. They can act as both HIPs and HIUs. So when a copy of the data is flowing from some other hospital to your locker, you're acting as a HIU.
Correct.
When you're sharing data from the locker is acting as a HIP.
Sure. But as an entity, should I register as an HIP and HIU with NDHM?
No. There is a separate registration for lockers.
Okay, got it. Sorry.
Because we need to know that you're a locker.
Got it. Okay. And if this locker also has a doctor-facing interface, which is outside of the locker form factor, I mean, so between these two entities, also it will work as a HIP HIU construct.
I mean, see, typically we don't think. See, locker is on the side of the individual.
Correct.
So there can be a view for the patient into the locker, but a view to a doctor should be only through this whole consent-based process.
Sure. Got it. Thanks.
We have Sohit.
So Kiran, this is a follow-up to what Benoy was saying. in terms of a use case where an HIU, sorry, where a locker probably needs to push out a document to an HIU, because the user is doing it directly, there is a case where you go to a doctor and the doctor on the spot says that, hey, do you have your past reports? Can you share that? We also believe that that whole process of instead of initiating the request from the HIU and then going through the consent mechanism process, that can probably be streamlined, that where from the locker you should be able to directly push the record into an HIU.
Let's discuss this offline, and I'm happy to receive some inputs on this particular flow that you are talking about. And if there are certain modifications that need to be done to the architecture to support it, we'll look at how to go through that. Yeah.
Done. Sure. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think if there are no more questions, Sukrit, you can continue.
Sure. Okay. So coming to the next type of API, next type of request, it is a subscription request, right? So what are subscription requests? Essentially, these are created by HIUs to be notified whenever new data is available for a patient, right? So HIUs create it, and of course, patients will have to approve it. Once approved, HIU will be notified whenever new data is available. Okay? And on getting a notification, HIUs are expected to fetch the record, right? Please note that fetching records happens using the usual consent flow. So that is outside of the subscription request. The subscription will just tell you that, hey, there is new data for this patient at this hospital. Or it can be even more specific, like there is new care context at this hospital for this hospital, for so-and-so patient, right? So how do we see this? Similar approach. The list all APIs are there. Okay. So in the requested state, there will be a subscription. Now I see that a subscription request has been created with this ID, patient, and then this is the HIU. These are the details of the subscription request on the PHR app. Just go back. So people can go and see the subscription detail. Okay. So this is the subscription request. So all the details are populated from here. Again, the HIPs are not a part of it because means HIPs may or may not be a part of it. It depends on how the subscription request is created. Okay, but during approval, it will be a part of it. So I need the request ID, and there is a approved subscriptions API. Similar to consent approval, it requires a lot of details. Let's look at the API first. So a subscription request is created in order to approve that. So this is the schema. If you see, there's a field called is applicable for HIPs, which can be true or false. Okay. If it is false, that means it's not applicable for all HIPs. So you will have to give the HIP details in the included sources. If it is true, that means it is applicable for all HIPs. You can exclude specific things based on the excluded sources. Okay. So here it means the combination can be used to grant subscription request. Say, for example, I want to give subscription request for a particular HI type from a particular HIP. Those things can be done if we leverage fields here properly. And there's a purpose and a link and a categories. The category here supported a link and data. So what link means is HIUs to receive notification whenever there is new link added or new care context added. The data notification means suppose there is an existing care context, but new data is generated for that, which can very well be the case when in case of say lab reports, where the data is generated later. So those are the two different categories and the period for which it expects the notification. So, same thing. Here is the so while the user approves, user can set all these things and go ahead and approve the request.
The URL is not correct. You missed the / before approve.
So yeah, it gets approved. Now, if I go back to the list again, I won't see it in the requested, but if I change my status to granted here, I will see that this was granted. Okay. So moving on to the next kind of request, which is a locker setup request. Again, there are APIs to deny or deny subscription requests and edit subscription requests, and also list the details. We're not going into details of those right now. So next, coming to a locker setup request. As the name says, it's for lockers, but construct-wise, there is nothing as a locker setup request. It is nothing but a combination of a subscription request and an authorization request coming from a locker. Okay. And what happens is when patients approve it, they, along with approval of the subscription and the authorization, they can set up an auto approval policy. Right. So let's talk a bit about the auto approval policy before we look at the locker setup request. So an auto approval policy is a policy that can be set up by the users, which will enable automatic approval of consent requests only from different HIUs. Okay. And how can one set it up? There is an API, of course. To consent, there is an API called auto approve. This can be used to set up the auto approval policy. And there are a couple of other APIs which can be used to enable or disable the auto approval. Right. So let's have a look at this. So this API expects a token again, and this again should be a successful verification of PIN. So basically, this is the consent PIN temporary token generated by the consent PIN. Right. So as of right now, we just published this API, so it is working with a user's auth token, but we'll change it again. It should not ideally work with the user's auth token. It should be the consent PIN token. Okay. And the structure here, if you see, it's very similar to what you saw in case of a subscription. And recommendation generally is like to set up auto approval policies in accordance with the subscriptions, because they go very closely. They are very close. They go quite hand in hand. Only addition thing here is an HIU is included here in the details because the user is setting it up. Where the subscription request also has an HIU, but it's not just mentioned here because subscription requests are created by HIUs. Okay. Similar things for included and excluded sources. And basically, a user can set this up. And once the user sets it up, what would happen is any consent request that is created, which falls within the bounds of this policy, will be automatically approved. Okay. So I will try to set up one quickly. So is applicable for all HIUs? False. No. So I have set up this policy, which is only applicable for my max healthcare, like one HIP. I've set it up for a demo HIU. For these HI types, okay, and from a date range is there, and of course the purpose. So now let's try to create this. So it gets created, the auto approval policy is created, and there is an ID. So now quickly I'll try to generate a consent request. So I have this, I'm trying this just for the demo. So I'll try to, as a HIU, I'll create a consent request. For the purposes care management. Okay, what is the purpose I created with? I created it for this one, so it will not work. Sorry, this is the subscription request. So it's looking at. This for the same patient. Type is open consultation. This is fine. Give the HIP ID because that consent request was, that policy was created for a HIP. So it got accepted. So now if I check my webhook, see I have two new things here. So there's a consent, yes, okay, didn't get created. So, viewer wrong HIU ID seems. What is the same thing? I think there's a problem with the my HIU, that's why I'm unable to create this. I hope the construct is clear, right? Basically, this policy got created, and it should ideally automatically approve if the consent request is created by this HIU for this HIP, and of course for these types within the date ranges should be within the period, and the purpose should exactly match. Okay, so any questions still here?
Yeah, we can hear you, Sukrit. So folks, if you have any questions on any of these consent management APIs or the auto approval construct, please ask now.
Hey, Kiran, this is Shuprakash here.
Yes, Suprakash.
Question Sukrit is maybe a little bit off the topic, but who would be paying for it? Like for the locker, is the patient would pay or the hospital?
Yeah,
will
it's a patient side. No. Lockers are patient side construct. So the relationship between a locker is between a patient and a locker provider.
Okay. And for the particular period and for how long they would be taking, there is some subscription.
That's all. Those are private contracts.
Model, private contract and business model. What they for? Okay.
Yeah, private contracts and private business models between patients and provider.
Right. However, the lockers who are offering the lockers, that has to be get approved by the NHDM, right? So that.
So yeah, locker is a construct under NDHM. So you will need to get your locker through the sandbox process and kind of certified. So you know where NDHM wants to be confident that you essentially have implemented all of the APIs correctly. That's all.
I see. But there is no legal compliance as such, or is there any legal compliance you need to do, or it's
No.
just.
So if you please look at the current sandbox and the sandbox exit process, I think that will become far more clearer for you.
I see.
So anybody who's trying to get a production access to NDHM needs to follow a process and demonstrate that their software has been correctly implemented as per the API and the API requirements of NDHM, and only then they can get production access.
I got it. Okay. Got it. Thanks, Kip. Yep.
Any other queries, guys, to the topic that Sukrit just presented? Okay. So Sukrit, we can move on to the last portion.
Yeah. So start sharing. So since now we have spoken about auto approval policies, so now we understand how it looks like in a locker, right? So basically, as a part of locker setup request or approval of locker setup request, it is expected that the subscription request is approved and authorization request is approved, and then auto approval policy is also set up. So of course, there are individual APIs to do these, but again, we have, since it's for a locker, we have a combined API for the same, the documentation of which is available here.
Sukrit, Suprakash here. I have one more question, follow-up question for the locker, if you don't mind. Yeah. May I?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the auto approval means how it may work if my assumption is correct. Like say me as a patient, I'm giving an auto approval. Like the auto approval comes from the patient side, from that ID. That means whenever I'm visiting, say, multiple, HIU or the health service providers, my information automatically gets stored into my locker where I have auto approved, right? Is this the
exactly
right?
Yes,
that is the use case. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just see if I can help you understand this. So when you create a locker, you basically first subscribe to notifications against a PHR address. So which you will say, hey, if there is any new records that are coming to Sukrit's PHR address, please let me know. That's what a subscription does.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So now the locker is getting to know that, let's say Sukrit went to a new lab and there is a new report against Sukrit. So when the lab publishes or links that report with Sukrit's health ID, you will get a notification. The locker gets a notification that there is a new record.
Yep.
Now, the locker, to be able to get access to that record, needs to create a consent request and send it to, it needs an approved consent request. So auto approval essentially is a thing that we take where the CM will say, okay, since there is an auto approval policy that has been granted by the user, the CM will approve the request without talking to the patient again.
Understood.
And you will be able to get access to that record, right? But if the auto approval policy is not set up, all that will happen is patient will get a notification saying the locker wants to get access to this new record that has come to save it. Do you want to allow it or not? So that's really what happens. So we it's more a user experience benefit for users. So typically PHR apps, two kinds of people will have these auto approvals. So usually PHR apps themselves, like the app where the user is viewing his records, will also usually set up an auto approval policy, and lockers will set up a auto approval policy. I hope that helps.
Right, got it. Yep. Thank you.
Yeah. So if you look at stop sharing, sorry. Yeah. So if you look at the approval of Rocker request, it again has three parts: a subscription approval, an authorization approval, and an auto approval policy setup. Okay. So before that, let's see the locker request first. So how do I create a locker request? I'll just go to a sample locker that we have, which is an NDHM health locker, and I'll just register there. It has been registered, and now in the PHR app, if I go to my request section, I see a locker request, right? And this is because of the same API, the list all API. So here. Okay, status is granted, so I have to change it to requested. See, consent subscription authorizations are not there, but there is a locker setup, and it has a subscription and an authorization, right? Now, as a user, when I approve it, I'll call the locker approve API. We look at the body here. First thing is the subscription, then there is an auto approval, and then there is an authorization. It just takes in the combined details and approves them together and sets up the policy. Okay. So for the subscription, all I need to pass is the subscription ID, and other details will be as per the subscription that was created, and obviously editable by the user. And then similarly for the auto approval, I don't need to pass anything. It will just be set up. Note that this is for the HIU as the locker. And of course, these data types. And for the authorization, I just need to pass in a authorization ID, which I received here, and the other details, as no other details required for auth. But yeah, for the auth and of subscription and auto approval policy, the details can be set up. So it created a subscription and an authorization, subscription and a auto approval, and it didn't create a authorization. It didn't pass back the authorization. So, but now if we see, the locker has actually been set up. So now if I go here, sorry, not here. Okay, I think I made a mistake in this approval. Copy the correct one. Oops. Did the auto approval not get created? There's some reason I didn't get back the authorization, but if we go back to the list all APIs again, that is gone. Sorry. So it's no longer in requested. And if I can find that status, what will be the new status to be granted? I think this locker setup request, something went wrong with this locker setup request. Sorry for that.
It's okay. I think we get the most of the concepts on that, Sukrit. It's quite clear.
So it's just to reiterate, locker setup request is nothing but the same combination passed in together in one API. That's all. Okay. What possible mistakes I did is probably copying it from one request to the other. That's why something went wrong. But so now coming to the very last section is something we want to talk about. Is like so this is how currently the lockers are behaving actually. Okay, so currently lockers raise the auth and subscription request, and using the PHR app, a user can approve them, right? And that's when the locker gets set up. Okay. And the last section, what we want to talk about is the HIU side of the PHR app. So basically, all these APIs are the management of requests and linking are essentially consent manager APIs, right? But in order to view longitudinal health records, it first needs to be fetched from different HIPs with consents, right? So now, of course, it can be done using the APIs that we have seen very easily, right? You can just have a HIU, create a consent request, approve the consent request, you can get the data and show it. Okay? But for a patient-facing app, that might not always work in terms because there will be few challenges, right? For example, how would you know when there is new data or approving of consents again and again, right? So that's where these are the few steps that we suggest. And it is also documented on the Sandbox website. Yeah. So just highlighting these steps again once. And this is up for discussion. This is just a recommendation here. So whenever a patient logs into the PHR app for the very first time, there is the associated HIU behind the PHR app creates a subscription request, right? Now the patient can approve the subscription request. As a PHR app, you would have the API to fetch the subscription request and get it approved by the patient. While approving the subscription request, we expect you to set up an auto approval policy for the same. So what would this mean? Going forward, patient doesn't have to approve consent request for your HIU, right? So this is the setup bit. Now, and what we expect in the next part of is post the setup, the PHR and HIU can start fetching data. Now, of course, the consent flow has to be there in order to fetch data, but when the consent is created and how it is approved is what this setup process will help you do. So basically, since you have created a node subscription and it was approved by the user, you can expect to be notified whenever there is new data, right? Be it new links, new care contacts, or new data in care contact, whatever, right? So the HIUs will be notified, and that is when they should create a consent request. So whenever the HIU is notified, you create a consent request to fetch that data. Okay. Now, if the auto approval policy was set up, the consent request should be automatically approved. It doesn't require the end user to give the consent again and again. Of course, it depends if the policy was set up correctly. Then once the consent request, if by chance the policy is not set up in the right way, or for some reason the consent request is outside the bounds of the say auto approval policy, it will not be automatically approved. But in that case also, patient can always manually approve it. However, we expect, like, since you are the HIU which is fetching, we would expect most of the consent requests from HIU to be under this step where it gets automatically approved. Okay. Post approval, it's just same steps for any HIU, right? It's nothing different from the HIU, and whatever we have done in order to build an HIU, it's the exact same thing after that, wherein you get a notification that a consent request was initiation part you would get, but then also you will automatically get the approval notification that it was approved. And post that, the usual, you can fetch the consent artifact, create the data request, expect the data from the HIP, notify the consent manager when you get the data. It's just the same thing. Okay. So what the steps will enhance is like, it will probably enhance the user experience, right? So any questions here on the last two sections, locker setup and requests and data?
I think that also brings us to the end of today's webinar. 1 second. Let me just see. We have, I think, a question from Suprakash. Do you still have a question? Otherwise, Venu, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, this is Venu. I have one. So right now we have the Diffie-Hellman encryption for HIP HIU exchange. Yes. So do we foresee that going forward?
I think we are debating, and I don't know if you gave that recommendation or other people gave that recommendation that instead of that, can we just use plain HTTPS
yes,
enforce HTTPS between the endpoints,
yeah.
Rather than add an additional layer of encryption? It's something that we are debating. So and Anshuman, if you're still there, if you have a viewpoint, please express. Because I think one of the things that since in the design, Venu, the CM and the NDHM architecture is outside of the data flow.
Yeah, remember
if HTTPS is not used, we may not be able to control the thing also. That's another one challenge. Anshu, any viewpoints on that?
See, the main reason is this, that the HIP doesn't know who is receiving the data, right? And that is by design, that HIP cannot take a biased decision who is requesting as such. But when you transfer the data, if you had say UK's NHS system where data moves through secured pipes, secured network, that was one. But one of the thing that we wanted was to leverage public infrastructure. Now, how do you leverage the public infrastructure and just HTTPS is not enough, right? That for sure that if I send the data, only the requester and the requester who is validated by a CM, because the HIP doesn't validate the requester at all. Only the original requester can unpack the data. So if you do not have that, this means then and just transport over SSL, that entire question about the security of the data over public networks needs to be rethought about, right?
So
it's not
we don't believe in TLS. So
sorry,
it means we don't believe in TLS.
No, it's not about, I think, just TLS.
No,
right?
TLS have to be there.
Endpoint, What I think Anshuman is pointing out is the fact that the consent manager, you think of it really as a control plane, right? We are not part of the data plane, which means that when there is a HIP sitting, all it knows is that I have to push data to some other entity. It really he hasn't done any validation or anything, right? It just is trusting this request and saying, okay, I'm going to now push data over to that other entity. So
I don't
additional
know
things.
Yeah.
Huh?
I don't know who the requester is.
That's the reason. Yeah, you don't know who the requester is. So in the way it's currently designed, the encryption, it can be the packet is only decryptable by the original requester, and the requester was validated by the CM before allowing this to happen. So that's the reason why the structure is there.
Okay, so maybe we can take it on offline. So what are the timelines for the PHR exit criteria? Is that already put out, the consultation paper?
PHR exit criteria, no, Sandbox exit criteria has been published for quite some time. So anybody building lockers or building HIPs or HIUs can apply for and exit the Sandbox right away.
But they need to integrate the OpenID into the PHR, right? So let's say
the PHR app is the new thing that we have showcased today.
Yeah.
So people can start that process right away. There's nothing holding them back. If anybody finishes the integration, please apply for a Sandbox exit and we'll have that validated and we'll push it up. Not a problem.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Any other questions?
Kiran, I had a request
Yeah.
actually. So at the
Sure.
end of when you are ending the session, can you please introduce your team members and just would like to know the names and what they're doing and bit about you as well. And if it's too much.
Okay, so I mean, just a quick, I think we can
Quick
have a
intro
summary.
was not been done because of the time, probably. Yeah.
No, not just time. Generally, we have avoided it in the webinars. But my name is Kiran Anandam Pillai. I'm actually an advisor IT at the National Health Authority, primarily providing technical advice on the National Digital Health Mission. So today on the presentation were some of the development team members for the building blocks. We had Ashok, I think, who might have left the call, who deals with the health ID system, and we have Sukrit, who's actually been part of the implementation team for the Health Information Exchange Consent Manager, as well as the PHR app, who helped us through today's this one. Anshuman, who's a contributor, is also a volunteer, also is an architect, who has been designing most of the pieces that on the consent manager, the health information exchange, as well as was involved in the original PHR app. In fact, Anshuman is a major contributor also to the open source project Eka code, on which several of these things are derived from. So that's the group that you see on the call today. So I hope that helps.
Thank you, Kiran.
If there are any other questions, we'll take them. Otherwise, we'll bring this call today to a close. It's a long webinar. So thank you for the patience.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I don't see any other calls. So I hope this webinar is useful to people who are trying to build PHR apps. And this webinar too will be published on the NDHM website. And we'll be happy to take forward any further queries or provide support to any integrators through the dev forum as well. Thank you all. Thanks for joining on a Wednesday. And
just 30 seconds. I'll quickly demonstrate the auto approval that didn't work.
Okay, go ahead.
So yeah, so as a HIU, I'll create a consent request. Now this time we see it gets, so I got 2 notifications on my webhook immediately. So few seconds ago, which is like an acknowledgement that it was created, and the next one was that it got granted. So it happened immediately in the background, and this was due to the policy that we created earlier. Similarly, say if I just create for some other data, so OP consultation is something that we have, and it is within the bounds, and that's why it got approved. Similarly, if I create a consent request, say for different purpose, care management, it will not be approved. It will just, the consent request will be created, and the user will have to manually approve it. So yeah, just that bit.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sukrit. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Anshuman. Thank you very much for the presentation.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you and good evening.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.